This is Naked by the Future Farm, where entrepreneurship is stripped to its vulnerable core. Brought to you by Vladi and Nektarios Lolios. Remember to subscribe, follow, and rate Naked to help us share it with the world. Maybe we should just tell people what this is about. Should we do that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so this is basically our sort of a first real reflection recording. And the idea behind this was that we wanted to reflect together with you guys on the episode that we recorded a week back, or that went live a week back. And also we want to go a little bit deeper in the subject. We want to bring out maybe sometimes some resources, different tools, but also reflect on what's happening in these days in our lives, but also around us in the world. So it sort of reflects on what you guys asked for, which is to create more space to go deeper and also to open up a little bit more from our side, like how we look on what we've heard.
It's also, we've noticed in the last season that sometimes we record the episodes quite in advance and things happen in the world and we don't have really the opportunity to talk about them in the context of our episode. So we're always recording this particular piece very close to the kind of the publishing date of the guest episode. So we can actually make reference.
Yeah.
And maybe we can go straight in there and say, just as an example, we're talking about James stepping down as CEO. And then last week, somebody else announced he's stepping down as CEO.
I have this full list here, by the way. It's like, I think, thanks for bringing that up, because I have like 3 names that are sort of like, when it happens, like when they say that also you are pregnant and then you see pregnant women everywhere. I feel like after recording James, I started seeing like these stories around CEOs and founders stepping down for all kinds of reasons. So I think there's...
I knew this about red cars. I didn't know this about being pregnant.
Yeah, you see, there's a different, parallel to it. But how are you doing, Nektarios? What's happening in your life at the moment?
I'm well. Some people know that I've had COVID over the holidays, the Christmas holidays, and I've been well pretty quickly after that. Actually, it didn't take me long to recover. But I have these moments where my energy drops and I'm not used to that. It's really unusual. So I'm okay. But then when I get tired, I just go, okay, now I'm just tired. And it's not the normal tired that you feel halfway through the day or something. So I'm learning trying to find ways to manage that. But I don't let it scare me. So I'm good. I'm fine.
Yeah, you've been quite good around, to be honest, calling it out. Like, when we are talking, sometimes I just recalled like last week, we were looking, or I think, not sure if it was last week or this week, but because we talked a lot together. But you were just basically telling me, right? Like, hey, I'm low energy. And I appreciate that, to be honest, because it's that check-in, which, you find in all the leadership books, which is like start a meeting with check-in, ask people what's on their mind and what did they come to the meeting with. And so you've been pretty good with that, which is nice for the other person who talks to you anyhow.
I've also committed to a couple of things over the weekend that I will kind of weave into our conversation because they're related to the conversation with James. Mm-hmm. And it's a mix of emotions. I'm curious. I'm a little bit scared. I'm a little bit apprehensive. Like today, I've got my first breathwork session.
Oh yeah, you were talking about that.
And I generally have no idea what to expect. And when I'm adventurous in many things, but I'm definitely not adventurous with this kind of thing. So it takes a long time for me to get the point and go, I'm going to sign up for it. And maybe I'll just skip the first week because it's easier. But now I said, okay, today is the day. So I'm going to do that.
Oh, that's brilliant. We did that over the Christmas with our other co-founder, with Nadim, as I told you. And it was certainly an experience, quite intense at the beginning. And then also the commitment to stay with it, to see the results. It's sort of a big commitment. I certainly sort of decrease the commitment, but I'm trying at least every day a little bit. And it's interesting because knowing the science, that there are data around like how helpful it is for your brain and releasing anxiety and stress, it certainly helps to sort of, keep up with it, which goes beyond the, yes, it's good for you, or sort of some people might call it more esoteric, and which is certainly not, but it's like also hard science and data.
How are you?
Thanks for asking. It's been, I'm like trying to take a breath, to be honest, but which I think also maybe reflects a little bit my past 2 weeks, and they've been quite intense. They were related to actually some of the subjects that we were talking about, James. You know how this works when you are working on something, like the episode and conversation with James, and then you take at least I really did take quite a lot out of that for my own life. And I've been trying, because of the period was quite intense, and it was related to mostly my professional life. So my relationship, or sort of my place mostly in my other business, the one in Pakistan that people might know that I do. And people, like I have senior co-founders on both ends. Like here, Nektarios, who sits across me on the camera. So that's in Future Farm. And then in my Pakistan venture, it's the same story. It's like, more.
So when you say senior, you mean old?
Not necessarily. I think that comes with it. But yes, they're all like, I think like what, 20 years plus 20 years of really, just life experience, which is very cool. And I'm glad that came to my life as a gift. But to be honest, it's also sort of challenging in terms of just, sometimes it questions you about your own self-worth and value you create in that sort of collective. And it's been quite intense of going into inner journey in the past 2 weeks. But maybe I'm thinking that we can connect to the James sort of story and what he shared with us, because it was interesting. The punchline for me from James' conversation was actually a lot about that radical self-inquiry or inner journey. And I have it here in front of me, like by, written in big letters, which is like, by understanding who you are and what you are wired for, that's the guiding principle and that's the guiding compass. So that was what I sort of took out of it as and I think I said it on the podcast itself, like a sort of wrap up or sum up of what I'm taking out of it as a sort of a main guiding line. What were the
straight in there?
This was straight in.
Straight in there. Let's reflect on the meaning of life. There is so there were a lot of things. There's also something about James's story in particular, where, of course, with every guest that we have, we kind of try to see where we have the parallels in our own journey, right? And sometimes you feel more in common, sometimes you feel less in common. I had a very kind of mixed experience. The one thing that I mentioned at the end is I felt kind of there was an element of lightness about it because he was so good at talking about the stuff that he did, but also happy to be talking to somebody who realized something wasn't right and trying to find a way out of it, and in a way that makes sense for everybody.
Yeah, sure. It was actually a happy ending.
Yeah, in a way, yes. But I was also envious. I was also listening.
Why so?
Man, because going back to what you said, he's 20 years younger than me, and he's achieved a lot, and also managed to navigate this piece. And he was very candid about, I'm still in it, so it's still all quite raw. But having that capability for self-inquiry, also realizing where you need help, which was a big thing for me in this particular episode, more clearly than in kind of some of the previous ones. The fact that said, okay, I need help, and there's different types of help for different things, and I asked for it when I was ready.
Yeah.
So I was and go, geez, I wish I would have done this before. Or I always draw analogies to kind of romantic relationships. There was an element there where I had to actually think about an ex relationship where I went, Jesus, I should have gone out of this much earlier, So there's all that packed into one conversation. But because we have this this environment where over an hour and a half, where we talk to our guests, it becomes very intimate very quickly. So it allows all sorts of different things to come up by myself. But I really enjoyed the episode, and I thought there's a lot of stuff in there that touches upon all the things we care about at the Future Farm.
No, 100%. I was just reflecting the piece because, as you were saying, like you wish that you've done so, or sort of like reflecting on where you were 20 years back, right? And I had to laugh in my mind because I remember what James shared with us, which his mentor, I think, told him, where he said, like, but I might want to be a CEO one day. And he was like, how old are you? And he's like 29 or something. So yeah, I think there might be a little bit lightness around that, in sort of thinking, I have this whole journey ahead of me, but which we never know what's around the corner, right? So this is interesting. So coming back to when you see the red cars or the pregnant women when you're pregnant. I'm not pregnant, by the way, just maybe oversharing, but that's not why I'm mentioning this. But so we recorded James. Then there was the news about the founder of Monzo and CEO Tom Bloomfield, exactly, that he stepped down, and there was the story around pandemic that put sort of pressure on him, but we can unpack that a little bit more. And then I came across the story of Matthew Cooper, who was a CEO and founder of EarnUp, and he wrote this absolutely, nearly ruthlessly raw sort of article testimony around stepping down because of mental struggles, mental illness, as he called it. And then I came across several stories of people, including, I have it here, Chad Dickerson, who was the CEO of Etsy, that people might know, so sort of famous company out there. And he had a little bit different story, but I found a lot of parallel, and that sort of like widened this whole conversation that we've had, James, which Chad was fired after 6 years of being a CEO. And he talked a lot about the struggle of transition as a CEO. And I thought that, yes, there was an angle with James and or Tom related to, or Matthew, to mental health in terms of maybe being sort of co-drivers for them to do the step to step down or step aside. But I thought there is so much of commonality with also CEOs and founders who generally need to transition from their roles, either from the inward reasoning, right? So it's your inner sort of decision, or external factors. And the way how they described the journey and what they were sort of going through really resonated. And I found a lot of similarities in there. So that was very interesting. And to be honest, I myself have been sort of on a journey with a CEO and founder who had to step down because he was sort of asked to. And there was something really powerful around it, which was connected to doing it in a way that was really vulnerable. And that was that the person was really open to the employees about the reason, and that it's actually really hard for him to step down. And that allowed to create it was powerful. Like, I saw people, and it was in a very different cultural context as well. And I saw people really tearing and crying around, just like it was like a circle, and the CEO was just sharing the emotion he was going through, and he was not trying to cover anything. And I think that was the moment where people were just able to really connect to him and understand the situation, although it was hard, and it related a lot to grief. So maybe that's where I leave it. But it was just interesting for me after the conversation with James to start sort of seeing and remembering those stories that were not just sort of stepping down or transitioning because, let's say, it was difficult or there were mental health struggles.
So what you're describing touches upon some of the things we actually always are keen to talk about, which is the identity piece, which is the piece about kind of being trapped, which is a word that James used, right? If it's involuntary, it's a different story maybe. But there is something around there also, you should try to put yourself in the position, is that you actually don't know if you have options beyond that because you're so caught up in this, right? So making that leap into something that's very unknown because you have no role models to show you that there is a life after building a business. There is a life. I mean, people would sometimes refer to Steve Jobs, who left Apple and came back to Apple and all that. But I mean, these are kind of still somewhat glamorized stories, but also getting permission to go, you know what? I don't know what's going to come next, but it's okay to leave because that's part of life and it's good for you and it's important for you. And you hear this from people that they didn't feel they had the permission to do that. I mean, James talks about his co-founder, right, George, where they actually had these conversations and he had the support network. And he felt, okay, I have to do this now because nobody else can. But at the same time, we hear all the other stories about people who just don't feel they can do it. Remember when we spoke to Carl and we kind of that video that went viral last summer with his founder, Carl Martin, who was crying?
Yeah.
And all that rawness and vulnerability came out there. That was a very similar story. He would have ideally at that moment, he would have just gone, I'm done with this, right? But you have to be strong. You have to persevere. You have to do all these things. I was talking to a founder last week who was telling me that he had an accident. He actually was physically unwell and he was in recovery, but he was struggling emotionally because of COVID and everything else. And his investors told him, I've invested a lot of money in the business, suck it up and do your job. And you go, how is somebody who's in that dark place ever able to come out of it?
Yeah. I'm thinking about many things in what you said. One is even the role of investors, which was quite a strong angle in both of the James story, but also Tom's from Monzo, in terms of actually in both of the cases, it seems that there were positive experiences, which I think was really good to sort of read or hear. But I can imagine that in a lot of the cases, it's actually that fear or that sort of the expectation that kind of, just keeps you blocked and locked, even allowing yourself, as you said, to even imagine that this could be a real step, right? That you would allow yourself. It was interesting that both James and Tom, so Tom, I read about it in the article, but James shared with us is that he realized that he didn't sort of or stopped enjoying his role about 2.5 years ago before it happened. And Tom had the same thing. He said something around, I even have it here. It was like, I stopped enjoying my role probably about 2 years ago as we grew from a scrappy startup that was iterating and building stuff people really love into a really important UK bank. And I thought that was that there is certainly something around when do you and how do you read the signals? How do you read your own signals, Nektarios? Like when you feel that you might not be in a place that is anymore serving to. And I'm not putting you on spotlight, but
no, that's okay. That's I had to laugh because I started doing something in 2014 with Startup Bootcamp that I enjoyed immensely, and that role transitioned into growing the business, which I enjoyed immensely at the beginning. And at some point, 5 years later, I looked back and thought, I don't do any of the things that I enjoyed at the beginning. So I was trapped in this firefighting all the time, thinking about the revenue rather than about the startups and the cool stuff that I started doing 5 years before that, right? So it's really hard to see those signals because you're trapped in it. You're really in it, and it's a hamster wheel. And you develop also this tunnel vision that you just ignore everything around it until you get the shake-up moments that make you recognize that a lot of stuff isn't right. That's why I said kind of the story resonated with me from that perspective, because I would have never said I was burned out until I actually left and realized how bad my sleep was, how bad my diet was, how bad my exercise regime was. It was all, I can manage that. It's hard, I mean, I don't
Yeah,
know
you were
if I ever
hustling
told you this.
through it. Mm.
I did Mumbai. So what was it? Mexico City, Mumbai, and Melbourne in 1 week,
Mm.
right? But it
You
was
know, a lot
cool.
of people, exactly. I just wanted to tell you that I'm sure that, some part of our listeners will be like, stop showing off. It's like there is
Yeah,
something around that. The
yeah,
emotion
yeah.
about what you said is like, hey, it's pretty cool. I remember one founder also told me when I was still at the fintech fund, and the founder was telling me, and he's like, um, he flew in to Australia just to sign a contract and came back, right? And he was
Mhm.
like, oh, I did this in 24 hours. I'm not even sure if it's actually possible, because probably not. But anyhow, it was like a short period. And I was like, okay. I mean, part of that feels like it is supposed to be cool. But it's actually also not, right? But yeah, that's maybe a different story.
But it's good that you pointed out, because even knowing that it was not good for me,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of enjoyed it, and I definitely enjoyed the coolness of it as well. I wasn't sure enough. I don't think I was walking around saying, "Hey, look at me, I can do this." But at the same time, I got a kick myself out of it, knowing that I'm probably ruining myself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not
And
linear. It's not logical, right?
Y- did you have
It's
therapy at that time? Like, did you already, like, because I know
no.
that you are using that as a really strong mechanism for you to create space. And James talked about, he wrote it in his journal. So I wonder around checking in with yourself around the signals, even if you don't, or even if we don't make the decision on that day. Like I certainly feel that in those moments, I kind of start suppressing emotions. So I start feeling them physically. Like these 2 weeks were really hard physically, like the somatic experience, because I had it around like my chest and in my, like a stomach. And when I was talking to the therapist, I described it. And when I was able to nearly like sort of put it out there, throw it on him, right? Like by talking, already that helped. It didn't address the root cause, but it helped me to sort of throw it out of the body. So yeah.
I didn't.
Mm.
I actually I had no time for therapy. It's as simple as that. I had no time for self-care. And I'm saying this in inverted commas, right? I didn't make time. I
Mm-hmm.
have a supporting partner. Would talk about things, and he was the one who forced me to take time off on a regular basis, like twice a year. Would do 2 weeks of complete disconnect, which was a bit of a lifeline. And at the beginning, in particular, it was also fueled by the hype, right?
Mm.
I mean, if
Yeah.
somebody says to you, I love waking up in the morning and having 15 emails from you, Nektarios, I was thinking, great, my job is to be there at 4 a.m. writing all these emails, because people actually appreciate it. And then you feel, actually, this is not good, but then you feel
Worthy.
you've created an environment
Yeah.
where you're trapped and you can't leave. But guess what? I left, and the world keeps spinning, and I'm healthier and better. Um, and I think that with all the turmoil and all the kind of dark days that come after you left the business, uh, you kind of have the perspective of falling on your feet again, or coming up again, or rebuilding a better life. And I think a lot of people just don't see that.
But let's talk a little bit about self-worth, because what I experienced myself, I know you talked to me about it just recently, but I also heard James talk about it, right? Where he was describing sort of driving the self-worth from being the CEO, which I think for a lot of us happens, and it's sort of connected to what you said around the identity and we're defining who we are, right? And where he's basically saying, like, when Sanctus was bad, I was bad. When Sanctus was good, I was good, right? So is that sort of success and finding your, again, the just worthiness in the nits and grits of the business itself and the role itself. It was pretty sort of scary. I remember the moment where he told us that with his first business, which was before Sanctus, where he actually left or it didn't work out, and he sort of found himself being, and I'm going to say it, being just a James that didn't feel enough. And I was sort of trying to feel through that feeling, right? That if I wouldn't have the Future Farm, and I wouldn't have the Neem Exponential, the Pakistan venture, and it's a little bit frightening question, or the feeling that goes through you. But I feel like, man, we should ask ourselves this question a lot, or try ourselves to face it, and sort of, understand what are the other important things in our lives. And just, although I really love, I have to say this, so the person will know, I mean, very close person in my life, he will laugh when he will listen to this, because we always had this conversation around, I completely resented the word career, where people connected me to say like, oh, and your career. And I was like, no, for me, it's not a career. For me, that's a part of my life. And I wonder, whether that's also a little bit of that, although I really love what I do and I don't find it as a work. So that's that piece. But I also think sometimes whether that's also a little bit of hiding and defense, just, behind this, because at the moment it is a big, big part of me.
It's so what you're describing happened to me later. Okay. I had a corporate life, and I took a couple of career breaks, which was just taking time out. Once when I moved to London, and one was in 2001. And I didn't have any questions about my worth, because I wasn't defining myself through what I was doing. I had a corporate job. I was enjoying my job, or I stopped enjoying my job. I left. Mm-hmm. And I had absolutely no reason to question what I was doing or what I was worth. It was more like, hey, here's a break. Let's explore something fun, or let's go traveling, or whatever, right? And then when things changed, because suddenly it was something that I identified with. When we started InnoTribe, which was still corporate, but it had a very different vibe, and then it evolved into Startup Bootcamp and Rainmaker, etc. This is where my identity blended with what I was doing, because before that I would never say, oh, I'm a market manager or a program manager, whatever it was. That was an identity. Yeah. That was a description, right? But suddenly it was like, no, we're here to change the world. We're here to help startups. We're here to whatever. So I can see how the career thinking influences one way of looking at it. But if you look at this as calling or purpose and all the other beautiful words that I guess
Parker Palmer talks about it as a vocation. Yes.
Yeah. Then it's a different story, and that's really difficult. And I've experienced it. I can see how it went from one to the other. And this is where now, and this is why we had this conversation recently, I look at my Twitter profile and go, I've got 16,000 Twitter followers, and nobody cares anymore about what I have to say. And I had my therapist to point out that, why is this upsetting you? Why do you need that external response? Can you not be worth? Full stop. I was like, what you talking about? Of course not. Of course not. That's why we use social media, because we want that response. Oh, somebody liked my post. I'm worth something. And it's still there. You can't free yourself from it. I can't. I can work towards it. I don't know how. I mean, you're not as active, and I don't know. You probably don't sit at home refreshing your browser.
I don't have a Twitter, and I am big time resisting. Oh my God, I can't say that word. I'm avoiding it. That's my way to avoid the word resist. But I have other, like, social media generally is. I don't necessarily have a super healthy relationship, and I'm still building that relationship. It does create a reaction to me when, I had that post on LinkedIn who hit like 300,000 views. And I was like, wow, I never experienced it. But what's interesting is that I felt like sort of reaction like that is in a way confirming. And you are like, my voice matters. I have something to say. People care. That created less of an anxiety or sort of a reaction for me than when there is sort of like a silence, when there is zero. You put your, and then what I'm trying to do is that I'm working actively on being confident in knowing that there are certain things I really believe in and they're important to me. And I believe in the value of sharing them with the world or with my community without awaiting their reaction. So that's the bit that I try to work on. And the other thing, when you were describing the self wars, I was thinking, and sort of the blended identity, I think really, and James described it himself, where he was saying this is super related to the role of entrepreneurs and founders. And I think indeed it's tricky because there is that hype, and it's just like, as you said, like, I am going to help the world and we're on the big missions and stuff. The piece that helps me is that I sort of started working on understanding the as we said at the beginning, like, what am I wired for? And yes, maybe this will sound a little sort of, buzzwordy around like, what's your personal sort of purpose and mission statement, whatever you call it, right? But what is it that I believe? And also with the view that this might change and evolve as I go and grow. But that helps me sort of disconnect from this immediate platform I'm using today to sort of translate that value to the world. And this is maybe meta, so I apologize to the listeners. But basically what I mean by that is that it helps me to disconnect that, okay, today it's Future Farm and Neem Exponential, but maybe tomorrow none of that exists. But Vladi is here, and what I believe in still matters. So the foundation is here. So I'm sort of trying to go and stay within the level of the foundation and be less connected to that actual concrete form.
Interesting.
Yeah, maybe we don't have to have a stronger closures, but
so no, it totally resonates. I think what I'm learning, and I think this is maybe interesting for our listeners as well, because I'm 20 years older, right? And this is now that I'm actually learning at 53, 54, not to beat myself up about not necessarily bridging that gap. Because that was the one thing that I struggle with, is actually not the fact that I'm struggling with that recognition that I'm to some extent dependent on external validation. And I've defined this as a bad thing. And because it's a bad thing, the moment I realize it's happening, I feel bad. And this is where my therapist comes in, right? Where therapy just helps me be kinder to myself and go, you know what? You're only human. It happens. But now every time I pick up my phone, and this is something that my counselor actually suggested, said, look, don't freak out about this. But every time you pick up and you check Facebook or Instagram, whatever, just take that moment to think, why am I doing this now? And if it's, because you're interested in some gossip or because you want to look at somebody's pictures, it's okay. And if it's about to see how many likes you had, as long as you're aware that this is why it's happening, you're already a step further down the track. So that element of self-care, maybe that's not the right word, kindness towards yourself, gentleness, which we don't necessarily have when everything is so hyped up, has been already quite helpful. So I'm going to build another bridge to the conversation with James. So the big thing for me this week is I actually registered for his journaling group.
Okay.
Because we talk about in the episode that I'm quite reluctant, quite apprehensive. So it's also a little bit of challenging myself and go, we haven't tried it. Why are you negative about it or reluctant? So from tomorrow, I'll actually be kind of experiencing it. And if it works, fine. If it doesn't work, that's fine too. So the next time we do reflections, we can check in on that and see how that worked. Because that's what journaling does as well, is kind of gets you to kind of just look inside and go, how do I feel today? Why did I feel bad yesterday? What happened? And all these things, right? So watch this space. You can be part of my journaling journey.
I'm certainly watching the space, even if nobody else is watching Nektarios. So I will be your, one fan there. But I hear you, because yes, creating that space around whether it's journaling, I journal on and off. I have this small book, and I tried to read back and it felt sort of embarrassing. So I don't know, what other feelings people have, but it's just like, it's nearly like you are naked in front of yourself. And it's sort of, I know that, sort of should be okay, but I think it's also a path to find that, within that relationship with yourself, right? But I think the idea around creating that space, whether it's through verbal, just like sharing with somebody, or writing, on a journal, or a different method, I think came up as a strong piece from the conversation with James, but also from the other stories where people were saying that the ability to take a step back, take a perspective out of that sort of hamster wheel, is really critical for connecting with yourself, and just connecting with that more inner self. I love the fact that we sort of, we left it there, but also James left it there in the conversation, where it was like, it was without yes, there was a step he took, which was to step down or step aside, which I love that he said, but there wasn't like an ending to it. I actually sort of felt half embarrassed and half scared to ask him that question around, hey, and so what's next? And I was like doubting myself when I asked the question. I was like, you know what? Maybe that's not the question people necessarily need to hear when they decide to do the step. And he's just like, it's about sort of staying and facing it, right? Staying in it or within it and facing the feeling and figuring it out. So I love the sort of, maybe that's kind of one of my last maybe reflection, is that I love the fact that it's a continuous journey, which it really is. And he can be CEO and founder of as many companies he wants or not. And that's equally okay. So yeah, it's about the acceptance also. Yeah.
So this is a first longer reflection. It's been quite, I love the fact that we bring ourselves in, because it translates some of the things as well, because it shows that a lot of these experiences are universal.
Exactly.
So hopefully there's more. I'm already excited about the episode we've lined up for next week.
Which is, okay, we won't tell.
We won't tell.
We won't tell.
We won't tell. It's a secret.
Okay. Guys, have a good day wherever you are. Create space for yourself, and it's a continuous journey. So we will see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye, Nektarios.
Bye, Vladi. You've been listening to Naked by The Future Farm, where entrepreneurship is stripped to its vulnerable core. To learn more about our work, sign up to our newsletter or visit thefuturefarm.co, where you can also apply to be a Naked guest. Naked is produced by Dan Turgel and edited by Catherine Dworkin. And remember, subscribe, follow, and rate Naked to help share it with the world.